Jordan Peterson's fifth rule in 12 Rules for Life, it really hits you right away. Do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them.
Hmm.
Now, on the surface, that might sound, I don't know, almost too obvious, or maybe even a little severe.
Right. You might think, well, of course, or isn't that a bit hard?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But this isn't just like a simple parenting tip. It feels more like a gateway to understand these pretty fundamental ideas about raising kids and even how we interact in society.
Definitely.
So today we're going to unpack this rule for you, drawing straight from Peterson's thinking. See what core insights we can, pull out.
And what's compelling is how he immediately anchors this rule in those, well, those everyday parenting flashpoints, things we've all seen.
Totally. Like what?
Think about it, a kid having a total meltdown in public, or parents who seem powerless against a really demanding toddler, or maybe kids who just completely disrupt a social gathering.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Been there, seen that.
He even gives this specific example of a mother who kind of seems to encourage her son's aggressive behavior towards his sister.
Right.
These aren't abstract situations, are they? They're the kinds of things many of us have either witnessed or, frankly, experienced directly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the immediate irritation, the annoyance these behaviors cause in the moment.
No, it's deeper.
Peterson's pointing to the consequences of inaction. That child screaming in the airport, for instance. He suggests that a timely intervention, maybe just stepping in firmly, could have actually prevented the whole ordeal.
Instead, the parents, maybe without meaning to, let their child become, what did he say, the object of a crowd's contempt?
Yeah, strong words. So a key insight right there is that even these seemingly minor instances, these unchecked behaviors, they can have real social consequences for the child down the line.
And if we connect this to a broader idea, Peterson argues that by not addressing these negative behaviors, parents are actually, well, doing their children a disservice. They're missing these crucial opportunities to learn self-regulation, right? To understand where the boundaries actually lie, and to develop the ability to act independently, but within reasonable limits.
Okay, that makes sense.
He even touches on this concept, it's quite interesting, that a lack of early structure can paradoxically lead to a need for much more rigid control later in life. Like, too much chaos early on can breed a desire for absolute order.
Right. Consider that other example he gives, the child who hits their sibling and the mother just doesn't seem to mind.
Yeah.
Peterson interprets this as potentially instilling a sense of maybe entitlement in the child. The idea that their actions won't have negative repercussions, at least not from the person who matters most.
That their primary caregiver approves, or at least tolerates it.
And building on this idea of unintended consequences, Peterson then briefly dips into cultural norms and even some biological perspectives. It gets interesting there.
It does. This brings up an interesting, maybe slightly uncomfortable question about the underlying motivations in parenting sometimes.
Like what?
Well, Peterson touches on why certain cultures might have historically favored male children. He references, evolutionary arguments related to reproductive success, sons maybe having more potential offspring, that sort of thing. He mentions Freud's concept, too, about a mother's favorite potentially developing a feeling of a conqueror.
A conqueror? Wow.
Yeah. But he quickly balances this, and this is important, by highlighting the potential dangers, the Genghis Khans of the world, whose achievements came at a massive cost to others.
Right. Not exactly a role model you want to cultivate.
Precisely. And he links this to Richard Dawkins' idea of the selfish gene. So the key insight here seems to be that even seemingly natural biases or inclinations can lead to pretty detrimental parenting practices if they're not consciously examined and addressed.
It's a stark reminder, isn't it, that what might feel like a natural inclination, maybe favoring one child slightly, could actually be harmful in the long run if you're not careful.
Absolutely. And Peterson doesn't shy away from acknowledging darker possibilities either. He recognizes that sometimes unconscious or maybe even conscious negative feelings can override a parent's concern for their child, regardless of gender.
That story he tells about the neglected 4-year-old boy, it's tough to read.
It really is. It illustrates that heartbreaking reality that sometimes things go very wrong.
So moving from those bigger, maybe rarer issues, what's particularly important, as Peterson points out, is the cumulative effect of those seemingly insignificant everyday problems.
Yes, the quotidian concerns, as he calls them. Basically, the small daily hassles that can deceptively feel trivial.
Like the bedtime battle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Take the example of a parent struggling to get their child to sleep for, say, 45 minutes every single night.
Seems like a minor inconvenience in the grand scheme, maybe.
Perhaps. But Peterson does the math, right? He shows how it adds up to a tremendous amount of lost time over a year, like weeks of work time.
Wow, when you put it like that.
And maybe more significantly, it breeds growing resentment and frustration. For the parent, sure, but probably for the child, too. It creates this negative loop.
Absolutely. And this leads directly into his critique of that, often heard sentiment. There are no bad children, only bad parents.
Ah, yes. The romantic view.
It's a very appealing idea, isn't it? This almost romantic view of children as inherently innocent beings, only corrupted by society. But Peterson strongly challenges this.
He does. He brings up Rousseau, the philosopher, often linked with this noble savage idea. But he also cleverly points out Rousseau's own significant shortcomings as a parent himself.
Ouch. Yeah.
Peterson argues that this idea of children being born completely pure and unblemished, it's not just unrealistic, it also ignores a lot of evidence about inherent human tendencies.
What kind of evidence?
Well, he points to the prevalence of bullying in schools, which sadly seems almost universal. He mentions William Golding's Lord of the Flies.
A fictional example, but powerful.
Right. And he even brings in Jane Goodall's observations of quite violent, even brutal behavior among chimpanzees.
So not just humans, then.
Exactly. These examples suggest that certain difficult behaviors aren't solely a product of a flawed society or bad parenting. They might be more deeply rooted.
It's a powerful set of counterpoints. It shows that difficult behavior isn't just something learned from a bad environment.
He even mentions data showing higher rates of violence in some hunter-gatherer societies compared to modern industrialized nations. Thinkers like Steven Pinker have explored this too.
So the crucial takeaway here isn't necessarily that children are inherently bad, right? That's not the point.
No, not at all. But rather that they aren't blank slates. They're not born perfectly socialized. They require guidance, socialization, discipline, encouragement, training, essentially.
He makes that analogy, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Comparing their need for socialization to that of, like, dogs needing to learn how to behave within a pack or a home.
Yeah, it's a useful comparison. Dogs aren't born knowing not to chew the furniture or jump on guests. They need to be taught the rules.
And this brings us right back to a central part of the role of parents in setting these boundaries, teaching these rules.
Precisely. Peterson discusses this very contemporary fear, you see it a lot, the parental fear of not being liked by their children if they actually implement discipline.
The desire to be a friend first.
Exactly. This desire to be a friend first, maybe above being a parent, he contends, can actually be detrimental, not just to the child's development, but to the parent-child relationship itself in the long run.
How so?
Because he emphasizes parents are more than just friends, or they should be.
Right.
They carry this fundamental responsibility, this duty, to teach their children how to behave appropriately, how to interact with the world in a way that allows for positive relationships with other people.
So they can function well outside the home.
Yes. And he defines discipline here not as, an act of anger or retribution, but as something thoughtful. A combination of mercy, he says, and long-term judgment.
That requires effort.
It does. It demands genuine effort and careful attention. It's not the easy path, necessarily.
What's fascinating, too, is that he also addresses that common idea that rules somehow stifle a child's creativity.
Right, the free spirit argument.
Yeah. He actually references scientific literature suggesting the opposite, that structure and limitations can, in fact, foster creative thinking and actual achievement. Boundaries can paradoxically free you up.
That's counterintuitive for some, but makes sense. He also challenges the notion that children will just naturally make beneficial choices about things like sleep and nutrition.
Oh, definitely not. Anyone with a toddler knows that.
Right. He uses relatable examples of kids wanting only junk food or resisting bedtime routines. It's obvious they need guidance there.
And he explains how children naturally, almost instinctively, test limits. Like juvenile primates, he says. They push to see where the edge is.
And discovering those boundaries, knowing where they are, actually provides a sense of security and predictability for them. It's not about being mean. It's about creating a safe framework.
That anecdote he shares about a child at the playground deliberately stepping on his daughter's hands.
Yeah, that's a chilling one.
It really is. It's a stark illustration of what can happen when a child, through lack of consistent limits, concludes that adults are ineffective, maybe even contemptible. that they can be ignored.
And Peterson highlights that aggression, some level of it, is a natural part of childhood development, particularly in really young children, like 2-year-olds. They hit, they bite, they push.
They're figuring things out.
Exactly. They push boundaries to learn what's acceptable and what isn't. And consistent, appropriate correction from parents helps define these limits. It teaches children that aggression isn't ultimately a productive way to navigate social interactions. It's a suboptimal strategy, as he puts it.
His personal story about the challenges he faced with his own son, who was apparently quite stubborn during feeding time.
The spoon-feeding battle, yes.
That's a really insightful example here, isn't it? It shows the necessity of a firm but also patient approach, and how ultimately it didn't damage their relationship but actually led to a stronger one once the boundary was set.
Absolutely. And that other story, the one about the babysitting exchange, where their friend's child was described as a monster at bedtime.
Right, wouldn't sleep.
It really effectively illustrates how consistent limit setting, even if it feels tough in the moment, can work. He contrasts his direct approach with the parents' ultimately unsuccessful reward-based strategy using Elmo, I think it was.
Yeah, the reward just escalated things.
He also makes the point that when a child is crying, it's not always sadness or hurt. Anger is often a driving emotion, especially in tantrums.
Right.
And he suggests that in some situations, this angry crying needs to be viewed almost as a display of dominance, a power play that needs to be addressed as such, not just soothed.
Okay, so let's tackle those words head on then.
Right.
The ones that can make modern parents really uneasy. Discipline and punish.
They definitely carry baggage.
Peterson acknowledges the negative connotations, right?
Right.
The images of harsh authoritarianism, maybe tyranny they can evoke.
He does. However, he firmly asserts that both discipline and punishment are not only necessary, but also, in a way, unavoidable aspects of raising children. Even if parents try not to use them, they often end up doing so unconsciously, perhaps inconsistently.
How does he explain that?
Well, he explains how reward, positive reinforcement, is indeed a powerful tool. He references B.F. Skinner's work with pigeons, showing how rewards shape behavior effectively.
Okay, so rewards are good.
Yes, but he also points out the limitations of relying solely on positive reinforcement. It can be very time-intensive, for one. You have to constantly be vigilant, waiting to catch and reward the exact desired behavior.
Right, you might be waiting a long time for a toddler to spontaneously decide to share nicely.
Exactly. And importantly, Peterson emphasizes the vital role that negative emotions actually play in learning and, crucially, in avoiding harm.
Negative emotions, like what?
Feelings like pain, anxiety, fear, even shame or disgust. He argues they all serve essential protective functions. They signal danger or social disapproval or things to avoid.
So trying to shield kids from all negative feelings isn't helpful.
He argues it's actually counterproductive. By attempting to shield children entirely from these emotions, parents actually hinder their development. They prevent them from learning crucial life lessons in a context, the family, where the consequences are relatively mild compared to the real world.
He uses that Disney movie analogy, doesn't he? Sleeping Beauty.
Yeah, it's a really thought-provoking one. By trying to create this completely safe, thorn-free, negative-free environment for Aurora, the king and queen inadvertently made her naive, weak, and totally unprepared for the inevitable sharp point when it appeared.
Overprotection leading to vulnerability.
Precisely. And he brings us right back to everyday situations, like a 3-year-old who refuses to share toys at a playgroup.
Okay.
A parent's inaction in that moment might seem like avoiding conflict, keeping things pleasant right then. But Peterson argues it can ultimately lead to social isolation for the child. Other kids won't want to play with them.
Which leads to loneliness, sadness, more intense negative emotions later on.
Exactly. He cautions that the broader social environment, the world outside the family bubble, will often deliver much harsher punishments like rejection or failure than a responsible, caring parent ever would through mindful discipline.
So the parent is acting as a sort of buffer or maybe a trainer for the real world.
A merciful proxy for the real world, I think is how he puts it. He also addresses arguments against adult authority, this idea sometimes called adultism.
What's the counter-argument there?
Peterson basically highlights children's inherent dependence on adult care. Because they are dependent, it's important to teach them to behave in ways that encourage affection, goodwill, and support from others, especially adults.
It's practical.
It is. He emphasizes the critical window for socialization, particularly before age 4, and the really negative long-term impact that peer rejection can have on a child's development and even mental health.
So his point is that in a well-functioning society, one built on a kind of social contract, not all adult expectations or rules are just arbitrary demands for obedience.
Right. Many rules exist for good reason, to allow people to cooperate and live together peacefully.
His conclusion on this whole discipline-punishment point is pretty direct, isn't it?
It is. He essentially says that poorly socialized children often face significant challenges and unhappiness throughout their lives. Therefore, the real question isn't whether to use discipline or the potential for negative consequences,
But how?
but how to do so consciously, thoughtfully, mercifully, and while being very mindful of the wide range of individual temperaments among children. What works for one might not work for another.
Okay, so if discipline and maybe even punishment are necessary, how should parents approach it? This leads him to the principle of minimum necessary force.
Yes, and he starts by advocating for limiting the number of rules in the first place. Keep it simple.
Why limit the rules?
He uses the idea that bad laws undermine respect for good laws. If you have too many trivial rules, kids might start ignoring the important ones too. Keep the focus on what really matters.
It's like an ethical version of Occam's razor, kind of. Keep it essential.
Kind of, yeah. And the second part of this principle, naturally, is to apply the least amount of force required to actually enforce those essential rules.
Minimum necessary force.
Right. He draws a parallel here to English common law and the concept of defending your rights. You start with the mildest response and only escalate if necessary. You don't go nuclear right away.
So what are some examples of these essential rules he thinks are worth enforcing?
He gives some pretty fundamental ones. No biting, kicking, or hitting unless it's genuine self-defense. No bullying. Civilized table manners. Learning to share. Paying attention when spoken to by adults. Maintaining a reasonable sleep schedule. Taking care of personal belongings. And generally learning to be considerate company.
Basic social functioning, really.
Pretty much. And he emphasizes that figuring out what constitutes that minimum necessary force for your child is an ongoing process. It's experimental. You start small.
Like what?
Maybe just a disapproving look, a glare, a clear verbal command. Maybe, for a very small transgression, a light tap or a finger flick to get attention immediately. You see what works without having to escalate unnecessarily.
And he also makes a vital point about not letting things slide just because you're in public.
Oh, absolutely. Addressing misbehavior in public settings isn't just about avoiding your own embarrassment, though that's part of it. It reinforces the crucial understanding that rules apply everywhere, not just at home.
Consistency.
Exactly. And he shares his own positive experiences, like taking his well-behaved children to restaurants and how the positive feedback they got from waiters and other diners served as a really valuable reinforcement for them and for him.
A reward in itself.
Definitely.
Now, he does directly confront that often repeated phrase. You hear it all the time. There is no excuse for physical punishment.
Yes, he tackles that head on. He points out that as a society, we actually do employ various forms of punishment for wrongdoing that involve discomfort or deprivation fines, imprisonment, social isolation. These aren't pleasant.
That's true.
He also argues that in certain critical, immediate situations, intervention is absolutely necessary to prevent serious harm.
Like a child about to stick a fork in an electrical socket.
Exactly, or about to run out into a busy street. You don't have time for a calm discussion about choices in that moment. You act physically to stop them.
And his broader point is that failing to address misbehavior effectively in childhood, using the mildest necessary means, can lead to much more severe societal punishment later on.
Right. The world is less forgiving than a loving parent. He also challenges the simple assertion that any form of hitting just teaches children to hit.
How does he challenge that?
He argues that the word hitting itself is too broad, too unsophisticated. The intensity, the context, the intent, it all matters hugely. He draws an analogy with dogs again. There's a world of difference between a truly harmful bite and a playful nip that signals stop.
So, a quick corrective swat delivered without anger in a specific context is different from an angry beating.
Vastly different, yes. He emphasizes the importance of timing, too, especially if a physical correction is deemed the minimum necessary force, like that finger flick immediately after a toddler hits a baby sibling, to associate the action with the consequence instantly.
And he warns about the consequences of consistently ineffective discipline. If a parent tries milder methods that just don't work, and the bad behavior continues like ongoing bullying,
Then the parent might lapse into a kind of willful blindness, just ignoring it because they don't know what else to do. And that's really damaging for everyone involved, especially the child who isn't learning and the one being bullied.
So does he offer any practical suggestions for discipline beyond the general principle?
He does offer a few. He recommends timeout as often being very effective, especially when the child is genuinely welcomed back warmly into the family circle after they've regained self-control. The isolation is the punishment, the return is the reconciliation.
What if they won't stay in timeout? The runners.
For children who run away during timeout, he suggests physically holding them firmly but not angrily until they calm down might be necessary. Containment, essentially.
Okay.
He also mentions, perhaps controversially for some, that a light swat on the backside can, in certain specific contexts, effectively communicate the seriousness of a transgression when other methods haven't worked. It signifies this boundary is real.
But stresses it shouldn't be the first resort.
Absolutely not. Minimum necessary force is key. He really stresses the importance for parents to think through a range of potential intervention strategies beforehand, especially if they have a particularly persistent or strong-willed child, or when the misbehavior is significant. Don't wait until you're furious and overwhelmed.
Be prepared.
Yes.
So he then summarizes these core principles for discipline. We've got limit the rules, use minimum necessary force. What else?
Right. Then he introduces a crucial third principle. Parents should ideally function as a team. Come in pairs, as he puts it.
Why is that so important?
Because raising young children is incredibly demanding, physically and emotionally exhausting. Having a partner who can observe, offer support, provide a different perspective, and step in when one parent is reaching their limit can help prevent unreasonable or overly harsh reactions.
The two heads are better than one, especially when you're sleep deprived.
Definitely. He briefly acknowledges the unique and significant challenges faced by single mothers without judgment, but underscores the inherent difficulty and the value of shared responsibility where possible.
Okay, principle 3, work as a team. What's 4?
The fourth principle is that parents must understand themselves. They need to be aware of their own capacity for negative emotions, anger, harshness, resentment, maybe even vengeful feelings when pushed too far.
Know your own dark side, basically.
Pretty much, and plan their disciplinary approaches accordingly to minimize the chances of acting out of those negative feelings. The goal is guidance, not familial warfare born of resentment.
That requires some self-awareness.
A lot. Yeah.
And the 5th principle.
The fifth is the most general, overarching one. Parents have a duty to act as those merciful proxies or representatives for the real world.
We touched on that.
Right. Their primary responsibility, especially in the early stages, is to guide their children towards socially desirable behavior. He argues this should initially take precedence over fostering, say, immediate happiness or creativity, or even self-esteem, because social competence is the foundation for those other things later.
Controversial, maybe? Prioritizing social desirability.
Potentially, but his argument is that a child who can't function socially won't be happy or successful or develop genuine self-esteem in the long run. Social skills come first.
Okay, so in his concluding thoughts, he brings it all together. He paints this picture of a well-socialized young child.
Yeah, like a 3 or 4-year-old who pays attention, who can play nicely with others, who isn't constantly whining or demanding. And he talks about the positive responses they typically get from other adults and children. People genuinely like being around them.
It makes their life easier, and everyone else's too.
Exactly. And he encourages listeners, parents, to actually discuss their likes and dislikes regarding their children's behavior with their partner or friends. Don't pretend you like behavior that actually bothers you. Acknowledge it.
Why is acknowledging it important?
Because if you don't, you can't address it constructively. He stresses the importance of taking ownership, taking responsibility for your children's behavior, and also for acknowledging your own mistakes in how you discipline. Nobody's perfect.
And he brings it all back, really powerfully, to the central idea of the 5th rule itself.
He does. If your own children's actions are consistently causing you to dislike them, even momentarily.
Imagine the impact on others.
Exactly. Imagine the reaction from others, teachers, peers, future employers who have far less invested in their well-being and far less patience. The world can be much harsher.
So discipline, done right, is actually an act of love and protection.
That's the core message, I think. He concludes by describing the characteristics of a child who is developing well, thanks to clear rules and proper discipline. Attentive, playful, not whiny, trustworthy, polite to adults.
and highlights the positive trajectory that sets them on for life.
Yes. Clear boundaries and appropriate discipline, he concludes, lead to secure children and more composed, less resentful parents. It creates stability, order, and offers protection against the potential for chaos in life.
Which loops right back to the rule itself.
Perfectly. Do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them, because addressing it helps them, helps you, and helps them navigate the world successfully.
Well, thank you for delving into Jordan Peterson's fifth rule with us on this deep dive. It's certainly given us a lot to think about.
It's a complex rule with many layers.
The essential insight here, it seems, is that proactively addressing those seemingly small negative behaviors in children isn't just about, achieving immediate peace in the household.
No, it's much bigger than that.
It's fundamentally crucial for their long-term development, their ability to integrate successfully into society, and actually for the health and strength of the parent-child bond itself. Avoiding the issue doesn't help the relationship.
That's a great summary, which leads, I think, to an important question for you, the listener, to maybe consider.
What's that?
What seemingly minor behaviors, maybe ones that cause just a flicker of dislike or resentment, might you be overlooking, either in your own life, if you're a parent, or maybe in the lives of children you know? And what could be the potential long-term consequences if those behaviors are just left unaddressed?
That's a really practical takeaway. And perhaps this rule extends beyond just our interactions with children, doesn't it?
How do you mean?
Maybe it speaks to the broader importance of addressing anything in our lives, our own habits, maybe dynamics in our relationships, even our internal thought patterns that consistently breeds resentment or negativity. Addressing it before it escalates and poisons things.
That's a very interesting extension of the principle. Applying it more broadly to anything that makes you dislike your life situation, perhaps.
Could be. Well, we encourage you to continue exploring these ideas and think about how this perspective, harsh as it might sound initially, might apply to your own experiences.
We certainly trust this in-depth exploration has provided you with some valuable perspectives to chew on.
Until our next deep dive, keep questioning and keep learning.